This plane might look normal today, but in its inception, the stealth technology crafted in it completely revolutionized military combat. So today we'll explore its story from the challenges it faced along the way to how it ended up creating a new era of aircrafts. But to understand it all, we need to go back to the end of the Vietnam War, when the idea of making the first stealth plane was first proposed. Anti-aircraft defenses were getting way too advanced, and U.S. planes in Vietnam were constantly being shot down by Soviet-made surface-to-air missiles. More than half of U.S. air missions were focused on knocking out enemy radar and missile systems, not on strategic targets. To survive, pilots had to fly dangerously low to stay under radar coverage. Others relied on electronic jamming, trying to blind enemy sensors long enough to drop their bombs. But those tactics had limits. The skies were becoming too lethal for traditional aircraft to operate safely. Then came the 1973 Yom Kippur War. Israel, flying modern U.S.-built planes like the F-4 Phantom, faced off against Soviet-equipped Arab states. This resulted in devastating aircraft losses to surface-to-air missiles and radar-guided guns. America's air superiority was in jeopardy. U.S. defense planners started asking themselves, if a future war with the Soviet Union kicked off, with their defenses being more advanced, how would we get aircraft into enemy territory without losing hundreds of planes? By the early 1970s, radar-guided missile systems were advancing faster than traditional aircraft designs could adapt. U.S. defense officials realized they needed a breakthrough. That breakthrough started with a Russian scientific paper published in 1962 by an unknown physicist named Pyotr Yefimtsev. The paper explored how the shape of an object influenced how radar waves reflected off of it. Specifically, the angle and arrangement of flat surfaces could determine how much radar energy was reflected back to the source. At the time, the Soviets didn't pursue the idea. It was theoretical and had little use for their military design goals. But when American analysts reviewed the paper, they saw something more, a blueprint for a new type of aircraft. They realized that using angled flat panels instead of smooth curves could deflect radar signals away from the radar dish, making the plane appear almost invisible to detection systems. This concept was completely counterintuitive. Faceted panels, flat angled surfaces arranged like a geometric puzzle weren't just aerodynamically inefficient, they looked like something that shouldn't even fly. Many veteran engineers at Skunk Works thought it was impossible. It took the younger team members to push the vision forward and prove that with the right software it could work. That's where Lockheed's Skunk Works came in. The top-secret experimental division had a reputation for turning wild ideas into real hardware, and fast. Engineers at Skunk Works, led by Denys Overholser and Ben Rich, took Yefimtsev's equations and built a computer program to model how different shapes would reflect radar. The results were strange and ugly, a collection of flat triangles and edges that looked more like a crystal than a jet. But the radar signature was almost non-existent. They proposed a test program to build a working model of an innovative stealth plane, and to their surprise, the Pentagon ended up saying yes, and then began the production of something called Have Blue. Have Blue was a pair of bizarre prototype planes with weirdly angular shapes and no clear nose or tail that flew in 1977. And although it was unstable, twitchy, and hard to control, it had a huge advantage that made it all worth it. When the Air Force aimed radar at it during tests, it barely registered. The part that radar actually saw was about the size of a marble, meaning enemy radar didn't see a plane. They saw something about the size of a bird. The plane was basically invisible. Lockheed got the green light to build a full-scale combat-ready version. To keep the project secret, they named it the F-117 Nighthawk. Normally, F means fighter, but calling it that helped keep the Nighthawk's mission under wraps and deflect attention. In reality, it was a ground attack plane meant to sneak in and bomb high-value targets. Everything about building the F-117 was unconventional. While most planes are built from the ground up, this one borrowed parts from other planes. Instead of smooth, curved surfaces like normal jets, it was covered in flat, jagged panels. This weird shape helped scatter radar waves so they wouldn't bounce back to enemy antennas. But in return, it made the plane extremely difficult to fly. The engines were tucked away and cooled to hide the heat they give off. And to make it even harder to detect, the surface was coated in special materials that could soak up radar signals, instead of reflecting them like every other plane. But what the engineers didn't account for was the radar picking up the inside of the bomb bay, which was not prepared for stealth. The first F-117 took flight in 1981. Only a handful of top military and skunkworks personnel knew of its existence. This meant that the Nighthawk was a black project. It didn't appear on official records, and pilots assigned to fly it couldn't talk about it. Not even their families knew. The planes were based at the remote Tonopah test range in Nevada. Pilots, nicknamed themselves bandits, would fly into Tonopah every Monday, live in the desert all week, and fly only at night. On weekends, they'd go home and pretend they were flying A-7s or F-5s, because those are known aircrafts, and mentioning the F-117 would have revealed a top-secret program that officially didn't exist. Even the smallest precaution was taken. If a plane crashed, cleanup crews rushed in and covered it up. They even scattered pieces of an older jet to throw off curious observers. For nearly a decade, the F-117 flew in complete secrecy. Finally, in 1988, the U.S. government acknowledged the plane's existence, and the legend started to form. After 7 years of secrecy and silence, it had never seen real combat until 1989. In December of 1989, the F-117 flew its first real combat mission during Operation Just Cause, the U.S. invasion of Panama to remove dictator Manuel Noriega. Although the war itself was brief, this moment was critical. It was the first time the Nighthawk would test its stealth in live combat. 2 F-117s were assigned to strike key targets in the very first hours of the invasion. Their mission wasn't to destroy, but to disorient. They were tasked with hitting barracks, housing elite Panamanian Defense Force units. Taking those units out would delay any organized response. Flying in total darkness, the Nighthawks crossed into Panamanian airspace undetected. No radar spotted them. Each carried 2 laser-guided bombs and released them with pinpoint accuracy. One bomb within a few meters of its mark, rocking the compound just enough to cause confusion without mass casualties. The goal wasn't to wipe out soldiers, it was to make them scramble in panic and disrupt any chance of a coordinated defense. By the time the rest of the invasion forces moved in, the barracks were in chaos. And despite being the first planes over hostile territory, the F-117s returned without a scratch. No one saw them. It was a quiet opening strike, but it made a loud statement. Stealth worked. As time went on, the plane continued to show just how great it was. In January of 1991, when the Gulf War began, Iraq had one of the densest air defense systems on Earth. Baghdad was a fortress of radar, missiles, and guns. Most planes couldn't go near it without serious risk. The outlier being the F-117. In Operation Desert Storm, the Nighthawks led the way. While other planes stayed away from Baghdad, the F-117s slipped in and struck high-value targets right in the heart of the capital. Command bunkers, radar sites, communication centers. Their laser-guided bombs hit within feet of the targets. Iraqi air defenses didn't know what hit them. Over the next 6 weeks, the F-117s flew over 1,200 sorties and struck more than 1,600 targets, all without a single loss. It was the first time stealth warfare had been used on a major scale, which forever changed how wars were planned. But soon something would happen that would shift everything out of control. For nearly a decade, the F-117 had flown with a kind of invincibility. It slipped past the world's best defenses, struck high-value targets, and returned without a scratch. But on March 27, 1999, during NATO's air campaign over Yugoslavia, that illusion shattered. That night, an F-17 was flying a bombing mission near Belgrade. The pilot followed his standard route, one that had been used on previous missions. But on this night, Serbian air defense forces were ready. Led by Colonel Zoltan Dani, they had studied the patterns. They knew where the stealth planes usually entered and exited Yugoslav airspace, and they had a plan. Using an older Soviet missile system, the Serbians set up an ambush. Their radar couldn't constantly track the F-117, but they didn't need to. Instead, they used radar bursts, which is a quick, short pulse of radar used to detect aircraft without giving away the radar's position. They got their chance when the F-117's bomb bay doors opened early. For a few seconds, the aircraft's stealth was compromised. Those interior surfaces, not engineered to be radar absorbent, reflected just enough signal. Within seconds, a missile soared through the air. The F-117 was hit. The pilot ejected and was safely rescued hours later, but the aircraft went down in enemy territory. The wreckage was recovered by Serbian forces and shown on television. Images of the crushed black wing and exposed internals spread around the world. For the first time, stealth had been defeated. In the early 2000s, the F-117 started to show its age. Newer stealth aircraft, like the B-2 Spirit and F-22 Raptor, were now entering service. The B-2 could fly across the globe without refueling and carry a heavier bomb load while staying hidden. The F-22, on the other hand, was a stealth fighter built for speed, agility, and air-to-air combat, things the F-117 was never designed for. Both were stealthy not just from the front but from every angle, making them harder to detect in more situations. Compared to these next-generation planes, the F-117 was starting to feel like a stepping stone. In 2008, the F-117 officially retired from active duty. The Air Force stored them in climate-controlled hangars back at Tonopah. Some were seen flying again years later. A few were even rumored to have taken part in secret missions in the Middle East in the 2010s. To this day, F-117s occasionally show up in military exercises, helping test radar systems or simulate stealth enemies, letting the ghost fly once in a while. Thanks for watching. If you enjoyed this story of the F-117 Nighthawk, consider liking and subscribing for more engineering stories, and let us know in the comments what you'd like to see us cover next.